Hi there. So I wanted to talk briefly about the beginning and the end. Now, the beginning and the end of what? Well, it doesn't really matter. In a way, the beginning and the end of something can be described as an arbitrary standard. You sort of have to define it for yourself, and when you define it, like, uh, like I know this is maybe that's actually an interesting question. Are there objective beginnings and ends? Hmm. Let's take for example a water molecule. Well, as it's defined, yes, there is a beginning and end of water. Water just is an assembly of atoms, and then it disassembles. So you know what? I guess I'm taking back my original statement. There are beginnings and ends of things, and they arise because of definitions. We it's just how we know water. And I guess what you could do is there is a way that you can criticize the idea. Um, you know, you might ask yourself, how far away do the atoms of oxygen and hydrogen need to be from each other before something is or is not water? And no, there's the everyday conception of water, but then there might even be like a figurative water, like proto water, right? If you think about it, hydrogen and oxygen, that is like those molecules, if they're separated by the distance of the Earth, that proto water is, it'll take a long time for it to come together. And maybe there's an aspect of timeliness associated with whether things begin or end, like a water molecule. And that probably makes sense, though of course a proto water molecule doesn't have the properties of water. So that would probably be a determining factor. That the properties of water would be definitely a factor about whether something is water or not. And I can imagine as water comes together, as the molecules come together, then perhaps what might be happening is that slowly the properties of water begin to arise, right? Um, just as just as a function of the assembly of the water molecule, and it may be that there are more or less certain properties that are showing up. I'm sure there are properties that show up early, some that show up midway, and some that show up late. And so, yeah, as water comes together, there might be sort of a gathering steam of the water molecule as it appears. And yeah, that's just definitely kind of neat. The question is, does it have hard boundaries or hard edges? You know, it probably depends on the timeline that you're considering. If you're talking about femtoseconds or nanoseconds, you know, it may be a while. Picoseconds, uh, yeah. How long are you willing to wait before all the properties sort of commingle or coalesce into the water molecule? And you may not even be able to do a test that makes sense in, say, short durations of time. So there would be like a probability of the water molecule being a water molecule according to your estimates, because you may not be able to test it in time to make a judgment, because the timing is um, so rapid. I don't know. Excuse me for my coughing. Um, but yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like I mentioned, a lot of that is definitional. Even whether we're looking for certain properties of water to arise, um, that also is kind of a definition. It's one that I fell onto very quickly, but I mean, you can create any kind of definitions you want. And because, language is malleable, right? And, when two people agree on something, the only reason they agree is because they've formulated and agreed to certain definitions about what those words mean. And in absence of that, I guess you really can't say. So I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's the way I see the beginning and the end. The beginning of the end of what it's kind of interesting. There is a law of thermodynamics that's relevant to the discussion of beginnings and ends, and that is the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can neither be created nor destroyed. That is that's a foundational concept. Certainly, it has to do with conservation of energy, and yeah, there are aspects of it that are actually quite interesting when one considers, say, the beginning of the universe or the end of the universe. Yeah. And it also depends on how you define universe, certainly. And now, this, of course, does not mean that all knowledge is subjective. But if you're going to speak it, you may want to agree on some definitions. That's for sure, because there are contradictory elements in language, and that they're potentially contradictory. And so, because language is just such a versatile tool, especially when you can make up words at any time and you can make up definitions at any time. So long as you're sharing those words and definitions with other people that you're in communication with, then you'll be able to stay on track. That's if you can agree to the definitions that you're proposing. And who knows, it's kind of funny. I think that human beings, at least at one time, were sort of vulnerable, kind of gullible to sort of accepting whatever's definition about one thing or another. Today, people are so skeptical. And I first of all, I applaud the skepticism. But I think that quite often, sometimes the skepticism can go really far. So far that the skeptic might sort of fall into but what's that philosophical school? I cannot remember it at this time. Well, I think there's like a reasonable skepticism, and then there's a point where skepticism becomes somewhat unreasonable. Without the ability to decide and make decisions based on certain agreed upon decisions, then you kind of lose the ability to make choices, and that might not be in a person's long-term self-interest. Of course, a lot of that is dependent on the person. There's certain cynics, cynics or skepticism. I guess that's the school I'm thinking about. And then also solipsism might be another related subject area, where one only believes that the self exists. It's kind of interesting to think about how reasonable that position can be if well argued. Especially since our perceptions are basically our own creation. It's kind of interesting. Our brains are locked away in this vault we call a skull, and we don't have a lot of interaction with the external world except through our senses. In our eyeballs, we have optic nerves that get transmitted to the brain through holes in the skull, right? And we have similar things going on with our ears, and I'm sure we have other things going on relating to our senses of touch and taste and smell. Yeah, all these senses, the ways that our brain gets information, sort of pierce the skull somehow, right, to get to the brain. And we only have a limited number of senses. Now, there are other senses. I'm not saying that that we only have five senses and that's all. I I'm very well aware of things called interoception, which is how we sense the location of our bodies in space, and the real sensory uh, the sensory reality of that, and how we use interoception every moment of every day, and how it's so critical for us. Even our emotions, right, are sort of we're constantly guided by our emotions, and those emotions are sort of just interpretations of interoceptive feelings. I'm thinking about the butterfly or the tight knot in the stomach, the butterflies in the stomach sensation, which really is an interoceptive type sensation. And it's just, I don't know. There's a number of senses. There might be a lot of senses. There are senses relating to whether a person thinks of something as being beautiful, um, or rational. And I don't know to what extent those judgments that we make are senses in particular. Um, I have a feeling that, like a Gaussian distribution, the idea of a sense can sort of shift and change and loosen as we go from, say, the six senses, or the five senses, to the sixth and seventh and eighth, and as we delve, who knows, imagination may be a kind of sense. I can imagine there would be a sense around it. It would be a subtle sense, right? um I'm not sure. It's kind of interesting how there's a sort of a reflection of, sort of like, there's like, we can imagine vision sort of turned inward. That is colors. We can imagine colors just as we can see colors. Like, I can see red. I can imagine red in my mind's eye. I can listen to the note, uh, letter C, like C major, say the C major chord, or I can imagine the C major chord in my mind. That's an interoceptive type feature, and I can imagine I could feel, say, a table, and I can imagine what that table feels like as well. So it's kind of like there are like these, like, the hard sensations where we touch the table, but then there are also other kinds of sensation, and I guess that's that interoceptive sensation, but it might be an entirely different sensation. This sort of interdirected natural sensation. Anyway, there's a lot of variation, and it's pretty exciting to be a human being and have all these senses. And yeah, yeah. Anyway, there is a lot to say about sensation, and I don't know. It's pretty wonderful. It's interesting how, um, like I was mentioning earlier, that we have a really strong sense of beauty, and it's kind of interesting how that beauty can sort of, we can imagine a beautiful landscape and then envision in our mind's eye also a beautiful landscape. Yeah, yeah. So we have like external senses of beauty, and then internal senses of beauty. And that's part of probably why using our imaginations is so enjoyable, because, well, it could be flipped either way too, because um, you could use your imagination in a way that brings you a great deal of discomfort as well as comfort. So there's a lot of flexibility there. It makes me wonder about AI a little bit. You know, I wonder how, right now we have like different kind of modes that AI can operate under: voice mode and visual modes and text modes, and those are all great. And to some extent, they are a replica of the senses that we have. I can imagine there will be AI that exists that's got a smell mode and a touch mode and a taste mode, And those are just around the corner. I imagine they're happening, and they will have like there will be chemical elements that will be sampled in, say, taste mode, and the AI will be able to give a particular estrogen. It does have the possibility of sort of opening our sort of sensory world. It has the potential to open us up to new experiences, and who knows, maybe even new sensations. I can't imagine what other sensations there are, but I'm sure I'm sure there are quite a lot of them, and I'm sure there's more than 6 or 7. And it's kind of funny. What a sensation is kind of just like a feedback mechanism, right? There's like an awareness, and there's a feedback. We're sort of responding to. There's like a sensation and a response, right? And there's a sensation which might be a touch, and then the response is just the perception of the touch. And there might be. I really do think there could be other senses out there we're just not necessarily seeing. In fact, I could ask AI what senses it thinks it has, and I don't know. Here's the thing: there are one of the problematic areas of AI is this belief that it's like a different person, and it's very easy to fall into this instead of into this notion, instead of considering AI as just being the output of a software program, which I tend to think of it as. But it's easy to blend the two, like think of it as a like real intelligence. Now, I'm not sort of discounting the idea that it isn't a real intelligence, because it is, certainly. And who knows, on some level, it might even be considered alive and needing rights and all that. That's totally okay. I'm open to that idea as well. But I guess what I'm just saying is that our relationship to AI is just going to be changing over time as it develops, and as we co-adapt or co-develop with AI that we generate. And this is, I don't know, it's going to be I think it's really going to be an amazing adventure. I mean, just think about all the other species on the planet. I'm talking about animal species and plant species that we have co-evolved with. Dogs are a great example. What a wonderful companion we've had for tens of thousands of generations. And we've definitely sort of reached amazing milestones when it comes to the relationship between dogs and people. And we're doing something very similar to cats and all the domesticated animals and all the domesticated plants. I mean, really, they are co-evolving with us, because they're selecting us and we're selecting them as we learn and grow together. And I really do see us just sort of eventually becoming one with AI. I mean, eventually, that's probably going to happen. We've already got initiatives like the Neuralink initiative happening, where it's really just around the corner in some respects, because it's already happening. We're already merging the two. I think in some respects we are cyborgs already, and we'll all sort of be a little, every day we're a little bit more cyborgy. Our society, there's a point where we're just going to merge. I mean, at least I don't know what point whether it's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years. But as human beings, we merge with our tools. We become one with a tennis racket and baseball bat, and we become one with our car when we drive it around the street. And sometimes people wear glasses from youth, and for them, wearing glasses is like second nature. We become one with our tools. We become one with computers, computer screens, through television sets and computer monitors. We just become one with the things that we create. Too bad we haven't necessarily become one with nature yet, just nature in general. But I think there are a lot of people out there who have the gift of becoming one with the natural world. And I think that I'm really hopeful that somehow we can recognize who those people are and learn from them as we begin to merge with the natural world. On some level, of course, we are the natural world, right? We are nature. We are the universe, and that's a wonderful thing. I think a lot of people. It's kind of funny. I think our culture separates us. We all had a very early bias in our upbringing. The idea that we're separate from nature, when the reality is that we are absolutely intertwined products of nature, and we couldn't go anywhere without it or be anything without it either. So we really are the sort of the outgrowth of nature, and we are nature in every respect. We are natural in every respect. In some way, I think of like the distinction between artificial colors and natural colors, or artificial flavors and natural flavors. The funny thing is that even though this is sort of a definitional distinction. I mean, there's just variations in chemicals, and yeah, some of them were a little more intentional than others, and came about through a certain thought process. But you know, chemicals are just chemicals, and the natural artificial um, distinction is, I don't know, in some contexts it's very useful, but when I'm thinking in broad brushstrokes, the chemistry of artificial flavors and natural flavors is basically the same. And yeah, which is perfectly fine. That's totally all right. It turns out, unfortunately, there's a lot of moral judgment around that. Like, I was talking to a chemist the other day, and I was sort of bouncing this idea off of him that I'd heard in the media lately about how um, uh, emulsifiers were unhealthy for some. And immediately came back to me, and I applaud him for his response. And that is that, uh, he talked about how there was little distinction between uh, sort of chemical emulsifiers and natural emulsifiers, and that a lot of it, the sort of like the detrimental aspects of emulsifiers, is a function of like the dose response. And I couldn't agree with him more. I mean, he's totally right. Dose response is really the primary factor that should be considered. It's sort of like the functional emotional emulsifier idea, and the degree to which it harms or helps us. And yeah, not the fact that it's an emulsifier or not. Because I mean, every one of our cells has emulsifier properties. I mean, if you think about our cell membranes, right? We all have these molecules that are charged on one end and uncharged on the other, and that helps bridge the gap between oils and water. We all need these. We need these chemicals, so much so that we couldn't exist without them. I mean, can you imagine a human being without a cell wall? I cannot. I cannot imagine a human being without a cell wall, without cell walls in our cells, because we're sort of defined through the, the presence of the cell wall. And in a way, we are bounded individuals. Our cells are bounded. We are multicellular organisms, which is wonderful. And we definitely need to have some type of emulsifier in our body, or else we are lost as living creatures. Anyway, I just think it's really fun to think about this idea. The natural artificial distinction, and I know it's been shot through full of holes in common culture out on social media and places like that, and but it's an idea that continues to persist. It's like we've got these cultural things that sort of lag down our understanding of things, and I don't know. But like I said earlier, it kind of depends on the perspective that you bring or the context. Um, the context that it's applied. It can be quite useful, but it's not useful in every context. Not all distinctions are useful in every context. Some distinctions are useful in very small contexts, others in larger contexts. Yeah, it's just there's a subjectivity. I'm getting, it's kind of funny. I'm thinking about the subjectivity of language and how, I really need to. What was the name of that philosopher that had a lot to say about sort of textual analysis, that had a lot to say about language? Um, mm, there's one very famous author, philosopher, Tractatus. I think that's a title that um, comes to mind, and I know in a moment I'll bring it up. It's been a while since I've even thought about this guy. I really need to read his work, because I appreciate it's interesting how language shapes our conception of the world, and it's just intertwined, right? So this philosophy of language is really important for us to understand and to get our arms around, so that we can understand how our own perceptions and ideas are affected by the language that we happen to be using. I am very aware that different languages and their structure, like the distinctions between English and Spanish and French, they each sort of indicate a certain approach to life, as well as just the different words, and a different approach to thinking. For example, in the feminine and masculine type nouns, I don't think the English language has them necessarily, or at least certainly doesn't have them in the same way that these other Romance languages have them, or the Romance languages have them. And so, like, for example, like words, yeah. So I don't really need to provide any examples, but yeah, it's just it's yeah, our languages change our outlook in the world, and that can actually be having knowledge of that can actually be very useful. So that, because essentially what we're talking about is a bias or a cognitive distortion, and we can actually work around that if we know about it early enough. And study of languages provides knowledge about how we might be distorting our own perceptions unnecessarily. And yeah, and I think linguists have a wonderful sort of gift, and those who practice linguistics and who are professionals at it, or even paraprofessionals, and less than that, even those who are just enthusiasts, I think you gain a lot of insight into comparing and contrasting the various languages and how that affects outlook. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this little discussion, and I hope to see you again another time later. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.